Hello. This presentation is brought to you by Daniel, Christina, and Zane. So for this project, we looked at the profitability of Chase moving into a new market, Alaska. And the first question is why? Why Alaska? So for me personally, I've known several families who have had to pack up and move out to the final frontier. And on top of having to move their whole families, many of them had their accounts with Chase, who now had to go through the nuisance of finding a new bank. So beyond that, what was also considered was, despite having one of the least populated states in the Union, uh, in terms of per person, Alaska has the third highest gross domestic product. And then since they were formed in 1959, Alaska has experienced a population growth of 330%, with a upward movement well into the future. And so then the next question is why now? So JP Morgan share price has seen a growth of 107% over the last 5 years. And in addition, with the recession behind us, that paired with the bad press surrounding Wells Fargo, we took the observe, orient, decide, act model, and we've observed what's going on both in the market and our competitor. And our decision now is to look at new potential markets and to act quickly. So for our background research, we primarily grabbed most of our data from the U.S. Census, along with some of the Alaska state websites for income and household data, such as that, and the FDIC for looking at the banking information. So specifically for population, we were interested in growth over the long term. And so going back to 1959, we've of course seen exponential growth through the years. However, we did see a major variance beginning in 1985 to 1987, and the state was in a fairly harsh recession. However, by 1990, they had recovered. Their GDP was back to normal, their population was restored, and things were looking back up. So then after considering population, we then went to the number of households and household income. And naturally, there's a very strong correlation between the number of households and population. That was to be expected. However, there's very small correlation between income and population size. So just because more people come in or out of the state doesn't necessarily have an impact on household income or individual income. One of our next factors there was the unemployment rate. So after using population, and we were able to identify the more populated areas, and some of our criteria then was to narrow it down, and we didn't want to take any unnecessary risk. So after considering the population, we looked at unemployment, and we didn't want to enter any markets or regions where the unemployment rate was above the state average. So rather than just simply look at true outliers, we were interested in only regions whose unemployment was lesser than the state average. Entering a new market, we don't want to take unnecessary risk, and that was one we felt would be an unnecessary risk. And lastly, we considered the FDIC information, and that was specifically related to deposits and loans in the area by year, so we could tie that to whether or not, if the population increased, would deposits increase, loans, etc. So the problem, if you will, is we want to enter a new market. The recession has since balanced out. Arguably, we've moved past it, and Chase has been experiencing solid growth over the last several years, and it's time to expand that growth and enter some new markets. So Alaska was chosen, of course, because their population increased, but their average median family income is $77,886, which is almost 50% of what the U.S. median is. So even considering the increased cost of living for Alaska, each individual family still has a very decent income as opposed to the rest of us in the lower 48 states. So the predictive goal that we had for this project was to determine whether the market will contribute to the profitability of the organization. And our prescriptive goal of the project is to identify the most profitable areas of the state based on demographic, population, and other census data. So in the specification and design, to determine the market viability, our model primarily focused on determining population growth, and we were really primarily looking at the next 4 years, so where we were going to be in 2020. And then in addition to population, we were looking at household income, and then average income of Alaska versus the U.S. average. So in the table here, we're looking at the national family income for the U.S. And then below that is the adjusted cost of living for what that same dollar would buy you in Alaska. So it's about 130.2% of the U.S. average. And then taking in these various regions, Anchorage, Fairbanks, etc., and their median family incomes, there's a few of these that pop out above the others, but we did consider all 5 of these, and we'll get into that in the next several slides. But you could see that just at the very bottom there, the additional income above national average tells us that these regions in Alaska have above average wealthy families in comparison to the lower 48. So for the data acquisition, we really weren't required to do much transformation just due to the easily analyzed format. We did do some simple forecast models to project out to the year 2020. That was sort of our sweet spot, looking at the population growth over the next 4 years, just to kind of see where the state will be. Obviously, the further you go out, the more bias, or rather the lesser quality that your projections will be. So ultimately, we ended up going with just a linear model, especially in projecting our population. Obviously, the naive model was short and wouldn't allow us to go out to 2020. Moving averages were used, which performed well, but it got dicey as you got further into the future. And so ultimately, we did stick with a linear model. And as we kind of dissected the data, as we explored, in this table here, it begins in 2003, primarily because certain of the data was only available up to that point. Population we can go as far back as 1959, but once we got into some of the FDIC information, income, deposits, median family income, stuff like that, it was a bit more recent. As we dissect where do we want to be, we looked at the outliers for regions, and as opposed to just looking at the most populated 5 areas, if you will, or 3, we said, all right, where are the outliers in the state? And Alaska being the most densely populated area in the state, that was withheld from this equation here, just to see where the rest of the outliers were. You could see it's Fairbanks, Kenai, Mat-Su, and Juneau. So it was after looking and identifying the top regions that we then mapped out, or more rather graphed the unemployment rate for each of the regions and compared it to the state average. So that orange line there is the state rate, and anything that fell above that we just cut out. We didn't want to take any unnecessary risks entering a new market. So that narrowed it down to Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau for our target markets related to Alaska. So then, after identifying some possible areas to move into, looking again at the big picture of where we were going to be with the state, we wanted to look at some more of the population and FDIC data, which was deposits and loans and try to find correlation between primarily population growth and these other two criteria of income and loans, or excuse me, deposits and loans. So the correlation is fairly significant from the number of deposits as population grows. That R-squared value is 0.89. And then it drops off a bit for loans at 0.66, but still a very strong upward trend. And so enough to kind of figure, of course, that as population grows, the amount of deposits we could expect from customers would increase as well, which is a good indicator of profitability for entering a new market. So then this is where we started mapping out our forecasts. The naive, of course, really falls short because you're just using the most recent past data. We want to go further out than the naive could do, so that one was fairly quickly. We did use a moving average, and as we increased the value of the moving average, it became increasingly inaccurate projecting populations. So the most accurate of all of the moving averages was just 2 years. But then, of course, once we get into 2017, now we're projecting population with projected values, and we just didn't see the merit in that. And so really we ended up grabbing the linear trend, which has a slight greater variance compared to the moving average, but for projecting into 2020, it had more reliable and simpler results. And so this is just kind of where we spell out our reasoning there, and especially since we did want to go into the future, we wanted to be safe in the model that we presented, and we wanted it to be simple enough to understand and explain to anybody that would be using this report. And so this is where we plug in that linear model. We wanted to project out to 2020, and based on the results, we definitely see population growth upwards of about 35,000 individuals. And so we can expect those 35,000 then to, of course, increase deposits and loans, etc. And so here we've mapped out both the population forecast along with forecasting out deposits and loans. And so we can see that those continue to increase well into 2020, which would give Chase a good pool of customers to grab from, especially in terms of deposits and loans, giving us a strong forecast of profits. So this table here is just kind of a reiteration of what we looked at earlier, where it really just narrows down on the 3 markets, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. So we removed the other 2 that had the unemployment rates that were above the state average. And so income, and especially additional income that would be above the U.S. average, was very heavily considered in this report, simply due because that would be any extra income that a family would have. So when you adjust for that cost of living, it tells us that there's more cash, if you will, available up there, be it either for deposits or for customers who can take on larger loans, because obviously that's a area of income and profitability for the banking industry. And so that was very heavily considered as we looked at these regions. So our recommendations after all of this would be based on the growth and the correlation between that with the deposits and loans. We would recommend that Chase look into moving into the Alaskan market. There would be, of course, other studies that have to be conducted just beyond population and income. We'd have to look at, would the target market accept Chase Bank? Maybe there's products that we offer that aren't competitive with even some of the smaller branches. So maybe those people who are currently banking with Wells Fargo wouldn't be interested in switching to Chase regardless of some of the scandals associated with their bank, simply because they don't view our products as competitive. And so that would also have to be assessed. But given the information that we have for this project, we were simply looking at the viability of entering the market in Alaska if they had the population growth and if they had the income to support our organization. So in conclusion, based on our analysis, we do recommend that JP Morgan, they do enter the Alaskan market, especially the areas of Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. With these three areas having higher income, especially being much larger than the national average, it could be assumed that they're going to have higher deposits, meaning more cash in their accounts, that they're going to have much less risky loans, so less defaults. And so ultimately, Chase can expect to experience a profitable market, specifically in these three areas, and then it can look to expand even further into some of the other regions within Alaska. And that would conclude our report. Thank you for listening, and thank you.